Now, Trump and tariffs is a topic that everybody and their dog and mom seems to be talking about. But there's one angle that I've not really seen extensively covered so far, which is what is the impact of Trump's tariffs on Europe's heavy industries? So meaning on the steel, cement, car manufacturing, etc. Now, there are two reasons really why I want to be talking about that. On the one hand, because of how important the heavy industry in Europe is to, well, Europe. So if we take a look at this, for example, we can see that about 15% of Europe's GDP comes from its heavy industries, its manufacturing industries. Now, granted, this is less than for China and Japan, but more than for the US. Even more so, right now in 2025, Europe seeks to re-establish its defense industry. It's pretty hard to do that without manufacturing, without steel, aluminum, car manufacturing, etc. The second reason why I want to be talking about that is because Europe's industry, or so noises go, is in a very bad shape. Now, to specify when we talk about industries today, there's a two-way division. On the one hand, we do have the raw materials industries, meaning the steel, aluminum, cement, chemicals, etc. And on the other hand, we have manufacturing industries, so car manufacturing, plastics and rubbers production, general machinery, pharmaceuticals, etc. And we're going to go through 4 or 5 topics here. So firstly, we're going to start off by actually looking at the shape of Europe's industries, specifically its raw materials industries, steel and chemicals, for example, and in what shape are they today and how did they get there. Then we're going to look more into the EU-US trade and the general implications of tariffs on those industries. And then we're going to pull it all together and actually see what does it mean for the forward-looking part and what other developments are there globally that could push Europe's industry in one direction or another. Anyway, lots to talk about, so let's get going. My name is Philip. Welcome to Commodities Corner. So how are we actually seeing that those industries are doing badly? Well, let's take a look at steel. As of 2005 to 2008, we can see that average annual production was around 200 million tons per year. 2009 to 2019, that dropped to around 160 to 170 million tons per year. Then over the past 5 years, we're talking about an average of roughly 130 million tons. So that's a drop of about 35 to 40% that we are seeing currently compared to the values we had in 2005 to 2008. And a lot of this drop was already from 2009 onward after the financial crisis, but also half of it came over the past 4 to 5 years. Now, if we look at chemicals, very similar story, where we can see that 2005 production values really stood at around 310 million tons. Then we fast forward 2 decades and we're talking about roughly 220 million tons. So again, drop of about 1/3. Aluminum, similar story, went from about 100% production as of 2005 compared to 2005 to about 80% of 2005 production in 2023. So across the board, we're talking about 2 decades and a loss of between 20 and 40% of total production, depending on the individual sector. Now, the main question here would be, why is that the case? Is it bad per se? Could it just be that Europe's industry has matured as a society, so there's less need for steel and aluminum, etc.? I'd argue there are 2 major reasons as to why this is happening, and both connected to one another. And there's a third reason why I'd argue it's getting a lot worse over the next decade, and we'll circle back to that later on in the video. But for the first 2 ones. So firstly, Europe's industry, just, you know the drill, faces very high energy costs. And let's be more specific about that. When we say energy costs, we mean both power costs on the one hand, but also gas costs on the other. And we do need to split those two because when it comes to industries, we have about 1/3 of total energy that actually comes from power, or for which power is used, but we also have 1/3 for which gas is used in Europe, and then 1/3 is a combination of oil, coal, and renewables, etc. And gas is principally used to generate very high temperatures for which you cannot, or at least as of now, use electricity. So both prices are very relevant to the competitiveness of industries. And for Europe goes that for power prices, historically those have been about 50 to 100% as high as US power prices for industries. And over the past year or years, since 2021, that has basically increased to 2 to 3 times. For gas goes that historically it's already been about twice as expensive or even slightly more than US gas prices. And then over the past years, since 2021, that has increased to 4 to 5 times. And as of, well, currently speaking, we're still talking about very elevated gas and power prices for the EU. But we also need to bear in mind that, again, even historically before 2021, when Russia started to cut off gas supplies to Europe, so already before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we were talking about gas and power prices in Europe that were just significantly higher than in the US and also higher than in a lot of other regions, because in a lot of other regions such as China, Middle East, etc., those are subsidized. So that's the first reason why Europe's industry struggles. It's just very expensive to operate based in terms of the input, in terms of the energy that you need. The second reason is a bit tied to that and why it matters, because you could still operate industries even if they're more expensive. But the problem is that we're talking about commodities that are globally connected. Steel markets are global. Oil markets are global. Gas markets slightly less so, although getting more with LNG. But aluminum, cement, steel, chemicals, all of those are globally connected industries. That also means that demand and supply function on a global basis. If you have too much supply, too much capacity globally, that will affect every region roughly equally. And the ones that are being pushed out of the market are those that are just the least competitive, which typically tends to be those that have the highest production costs, which right now in a lot of industries, because of the first reason that we mentioned, to a large extent, is quite often Europe. And to again make this a little bit more specific, for steel, for example, we can see that total production capacity basically doubled between 2000 and 2010, which is, well, those additions were way more than what we've seen any time over the past decades before in the 20th century. And the reason for that was very simple, because China was building out its own steel industry. And you'll see a very similar story, at least for chemicals, aluminum, I'm not entirely sure, but probably also. It's a very common phenomenon where, especially between, well, over the past 2 decades, China has just been building out its domestic industries and accordingly has flooded the market with steel, chemicals, etc., which has led to way too much capacity, way more capacity than the world needed or needs, which accordingly pushes a lot of producers out of the market. There's way more to say on the European industry because it's a complex topic, but also one that I feel is ironically not really talked about much in depth, or at least not from the angles that I would like to tackle it, so I'll cover that in the future. If you want to stick around for that, feel free to subscribe anyway, with my bagging session coming to an end. Let's talk about tariffs. So as you may know, if we talk about the US tariffs installed right now, the extent of them differs by region, with the EU having typically 20% for most of its industries, but with some exemptions such as the automotive industry, for which we have a 25% tariff, or the pharmaceutical industry, for which we don't have any tariffs at all as of now. But it may still be the case in the future. Anyway, if we look at Europe's trade with the US as of 2024, we're talking about roughly 530 billion euros worth of exports, whereas imports stood at around 330 billion. Now, this difference of about 200 billion is relatively representative of what we've typically seen of US-EU trade over the past 10-15 years. So this is not an anomaly or anything. It's just that Europe exports way more to the US in terms of value than it imports. So which sectors account for how much of the exports? Well, on the number one spot by quite a long shot actually is the pharmaceutical and medicines industry, which account for about 22% of total exports of Europe to the US. Then you have cars, road vehicles with 10%. Then we have general machinery, 6 to 7%, electrical appliances machinery about 6%, and then we have specialized machinery, or for particular industries, another couple percentage points. Throwing all of those together, we're really talking about principally half of all export value going from Europe to the US. Now let's then talk about the impact of all of this on the beloved European car industry, because when it comes to Europe's car industry, well, there's already been a lot of noise over the past year that companies such as Volkswagen want to cut down their production, etc., etc. Now, when it comes to European car production, we're talking about roughly 14 to 15 million vehicles that were produced as of 2024. In terms of distribution, mainly Germany, France, and Spain, with Germany accounting for about 4.5 million vehicles produced, Spain for about 2.5, and France for about 1.6. Out of this production, about 5.4 million vehicles were exported, and the main export destinations were, amongst others, the UK and, of course, the US, Turkey, etc., etc. The US stood out with about 800,000 vehicles, so in the grand scheme of things, we're not talking about an insane amount. We're talking about roughly 5% of EU car production being headed for the US. Now, it's worth noting here, by the way, that Europe or European car producers already produce some vehicles in the US. That's roughly about 800,000 or so. So we have about 800,000 that are exported from the EU to the US, and we have a similar amount that already is produced in the US by European car producers, specifically Volkswagen, Mercedes, and BMW. And there's one more piece of context that I would like to add to that, and that's on the European market itself. Because you see, over the past years, Chinese cars increasingly went to the European market because they were relatively cheap, especially on the EV front. So in 2023, we're talking about roughly 700,000 vehicles that were imported from China into the EU. Not an amazing amount, also not negligible. And that's what the EU thought. So the EU actually started to impose tariffs of about 50 to 35% on those, especially EV manufacturers coming from China, which now meant, and which is the reason why I'm bringing this up, that for EU consumers, they now basically face the choice between either Chinese cars, on which there is a 15 to 35% tariff, although they are typically cheaper than European cars, or the resorting to the domestic or the Western car industry, which is by default more expensive than the Chinese one. So the common theme here is, and embedding this into the context of the tariffs, that, well, things are just kind of getting more expensive for the consumer. Anyway, speaking of which, let's move on. So tying this back into the tariff story, it's not that, oh, we have 5% of all of our car production that's exported to the US, and for those 5% goes that they become more expensive for US companies to buy, so they may be buying less, so we're using a small market share of a couple of hundreds of thousands of cars. It does have an impact, but it's also not per se game-changing if you just look at the numbers. I think a more pertinent lesson here is looking at what European car companies are actually saying and how this feeds into the picture of European car companies already wanting to cut their production in Europe. So we have 5 large holding or umbrella companies in Europe, car companies that is. We have Volkswagen, which is by far the largest one. We have Stellantis, if I'm pronouncing that right, BMW, Mercedes, and we have Renault, if I'm not mistaken, actually. So those are the 5 largest ones. And for each of those goes that to differing extents, they already have pronounced that, well, things are not going that well in Europe, may as well look elsewhere and cut our production here. Especially Volkswagen, which is also by far the largest one, has been very vocal about that, wanting to cut about 3 out of their 10 factories in Germany, lay off 35,000 employees, and cut wages by 10% for another 140,000 employees. So that's big stuff in Germany only, that is. Now, this was already going on before the tariffs. Now, the tariffs certainly did not help, where Volkswagen again has reiterated that they're looking to move some production to the US. You have Mercedes, which follows a similar line of thinking and has been explicit about that. Then you have BMW and Stellantis, which are still sitting on the fence a bit, but are also hinting toward wanting to move to the US. Just not clear in which shape, way, or form. So I would argue that tariffs really will expedite this entire process of EU companies wanting to cut their production in the EU and potentially move more to the US. But that's not only because of the tariffs. The tariffs are really just the cherry on top of this entire accumulation of a lot of different circumstances. Now, let's turn the discussion to steel and the raw materials industries, because as we saw at the beginning, they're still pretty big contributors to the overall manufacturing GDP, about 25%. But more than that, they're also absolutely essential for actually enabling any industries downstream. So the automotive industry we talked about, also construction, of course, in any way, any other form of transport, planes, and especially right now, of course, the defense industry. And beyond that, they're also pretty important providers of employment. If we look at the steel industry, that's about 300,000 people directly, aluminum about 240,000, and then the chemical industry employs about 1.2 million. Now, when it comes to steel, Europe is actually a net importer, meaning it consumes slightly more than it produces. Well, let's look at some concrete numbers here. We can see that typically over the past years, Europe, as mentioned earlier, produces around 130-ish million tons of steel per year. Its consumption is slightly higher by around 10 million tons or so, so obviously it is a net importer. Does not mean, though, that Europe does not export, because you have a wide variety of different steel products, and Europe may import some, may export some. Now, when it comes to the US, Europe exports around 2 to 3 million tons of steel products per year. That's roughly, well, around 2% of its total production. So very similar to the car industry, we can state here that the direct exposure, 2% of its total sales, of its total production, is not very sizable. Now, the point here is not that we have 2, 3, 4, or 5% of total sales that are becoming more expensive, or that we may lose because of the tariffs. It's again the bigger picture that matters way more, I would argue. And let me then specify what I mean by bigger picture. I'd argue there are two major indirect consequences of the tariffs that will affect Europe's heavy industry, well, heavily. Very sophisticated, that humor. Anyway, two major consequences. So the first one being that the tariffs are not only applied to Europe, but are applied globally, although to varying degrees. Now, what this means is that for US companies, just importing raw materials becomes more expensive at large. And for a lot of those materials goes, well, the US still pretty heavily depends on imports. Steel, for example, it's about 25% of its total consumption. Aluminum, about 50%. Chemicals, it's harder to pinpoint because the US is also a major producer of chemicals, but there are a lot of varieties, specialty chemicals, base chemicals, etc. So difficult to pinpoint, but bottom line being that it may very well be that the US steps down its imports, which would lead to more capacity being available outside of the US on the global market, which means that the existing phenomenon of overcapacity would be further, well, aggravated. Second point, pretty much tied to that, is that it's particularly China that's actually hit heavily by the tariffs, because the tariffs on China are 54%, which is quite a bit, and China is still a very large exporter of manufactured goods and others to the US. Now, with such a high tariff, it stands to reason that imports coming from China to the US will go down by quite a bit. In turn, this means that there's less stimulus for China's manufacturing industry, meaning its production could slow down, meaning there could be more steel, aluminum, chemicals, etc. that are not embedded in that production process and accordingly again are freed up for the global market. So the main argument here is that we have those two indirect consequences coming from the tariffs that could very well just aggravate existing overcapacity. And that within the context of Europe's industry that's already gone down a lot in terms of production that faces a lot way higher costs, etc., is not very helpful. But there's one argument that I kind of left open that I alluded to at the beginning. The third argument or reason that I'd say would put Europe's industry even under more pressure over the next 5 to 10 years. And that is the EU emission trading scheme. So what is the EU ETS exactly? Well, in simplest terms, it's just Europe's carbon market. It means that for some of Europe's largest industries, for, well, its heavy industries, for the power industry, for aviation, and since recently also for the maritime transport industry, there's a total number of emissions that are allowed per year, and those are regulated via so-called, well, allowances. Now, typically you would have to pay for each individual allowance, meaning if you have, take a random number, 1,000 tons of CO2 emitted, you would have to buy 1,000 allowances. And each allowance has a carbon price that's just regulated via supply and demand for the market at large. And let's say the carbon price is €50 per ton of CO2, you would have to buy 1,000 allowances for €50 each for your emissions. Now the thing is that for a lot of heavy industries, there are so-called free allowances that are being handed out, which means, well, you're getting the allowances, but you don't have to pay for them. And the reason why that happens is because heavy industries such as steel, cement, aluminum, oil refineries, they're pretty hard to decarbonize. It's not the same as just using renewable energy, solar and wind, because you have to reach very high temperatures, which you cannot reach by electrification as of now. So you need a lot of other measures, green hydrogen, carbon capture, whatever else you can think of to cut emissions, which is way more cumbersome than just using solar or wind. So to accommodate those industries, you have those free allowances. But now, as of 2026, you have the so-called carbon border adjustment mechanism that will be implemented for a handful of those heavy industrial sectors, specifically for steel, for iron, for aluminum, for fertilizers, for hydrogen, as well as for power. Now, what this means is that those goods that come into the European Union from 2026 onward will also be subject to the carbon price or to the carbon levy. Now, this is one side of the equation, but at the same time, while implementing the carbon border mechanism, the EU also wants to phase out the free allowances for those heavy industries so that there is actually an even level playing field. So the specific trajectory is that by 2034, the EU wants to reach 0% free allowances for all of those heavy industries that are included in the carbon border adjustment mechanisms as of 2026. And because for a lot of those industries, they're basically receiving most of their allowances for free right now, they still are not paying really that much in terms of carbon costs. Now, in terms of the concrete impact of that, let's once again look at the steel sector. So for steel goes, you have two production pathways. You have the so-called blast furnace or the basic oxygen furnace. And on the other hand, you have the electric arc furnace. And this matters because those two pathways have very different emission intensities. So for the blast furnace goes about 2 tons of CO2 per ton of steel produced. For the electric arc furnace, it's only about 0.4 tons of CO2 per ton of CO2 produced. And by the way, for Europe goes that about 55% of its production is via the blast furnace. The other 45% is the electric arc furnace. Now, if we then do some mathematics here and we assume a carbon price of, let's say, 80 euro per ton of CO2, which is roughly the range we're at right now, and we assume that there are no free allowances anymore, we would be talking about roughly 160 euro per ton of steel for the blast furnace, and we would be talking about roughly 30 to 40 euro per ton of steel of additional carbon costs for the electric arc furnace. Now, you can compare that against the current steel prices in Europe, which, depending on the product, hover around 600 to 800 euro per ton of product, which, well, if you then have 160 euro of additional cost, it's pretty sizable. For the electric arc furnace, the argument goes less so, because 40 euro compared to 600 to 800, it's not nothing, but it's also not, that big of a difference as for the blast furnace. Either way, EU ETS phase out of free allowance is not a topic that's talked about much when we talk about deindustrialization of Europe, but I would argue next to the tariffs, overcapacity and all that jazz, one of the major catalyzers of potential deindustrialization of Europe. To wrap all of this up, to pull it together. So Europe's industry undoubtedly, and there's not really any way that we can twist or turn this, is in a very bad state. And a couple of reasons for this / couple of indicators. So firstly, as we've seen, we have very high power and gas prices, especially since 2021, but already before. Right now we're talking about 2 to 3 times as high as US prices for power and about 4 to 5 times as high for gas. No good for the industry, really. Secondly, we've already seen that over the past 2 decades, European industries, some of them, have lost 20 to 40% of their production. Quite a lot. Thirdly, in tandem with this, we have global overcapacity mainly due to China's build-out of specific sectors such as steel, chemicals, aluminum, which are pushing high-cost producers such as Europe out of the market. Major reason why Europe has lost so much production. Now, fourthly, on top of all of this, we have the EU ETS, the free allowances that are being phased out from 2026 for some sectors such as steel and aluminum, which will add quite significant additional cost to European production, which already is pretty high in terms of production costs. Now on top of that, we have the tariffs, which is the major crux of today's stories, which I'd argue is not really so much about, again, the exports, the 5% of cars that Europe actually sends to the US, or the 2% of steel, but which is rather about aggravating global overcapacity in certain sectors, because less will be exported to the US, because China's manufacturing will slow down, which means there are more raw materials available elsewhere. So that's the major argument that I wanted to make today. But Philip, can't you be a little bit more positive and have some good vibes in there instead of just talking about how the European industry is going to trash? Well, more on that another time. But on a serious note, this channel is not intended to just paint a negative picture and be hyperbolic about whatever. I also don't know what hyperbolic means. But it's very much intended to just, for somebody who has worked quite a bit on energy, to put out there whatever I think needs to be put out there. Because I think there is a lot of misinformation within the realm of energy and politics, economics at large. A lot of politicization going on. And I don't want to contribute to the politicization side of things. But I would very much like to put out my thoughts on what I've learned, what I am learning on energy, commodities, how it ties to the economy, to where different societies are heading at large, and hence why I made this channel. I would love for you to join me and leave comments if you have anything to say about anything I said today. Would love to get your thoughts, and in general would love you to subscribe if you think this was useful, and to further stick with me with the ride, because there will be a lot of videos coming out over the next months, spending quite a lot of time on this, so you're very welcome to join the club. That's all from me from me for today. The next video or videos will be released on a weekly basis, really. So yeah, stay tuned if you want to. Love to hear your thoughts, and thank you very much for joining me today. I'm Philip. Until next time.